Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the GSE Storage webinar from Iata. We'll be starting in a few minutes. But beforehand, I would like to go over some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar delivery. Please note that your microphone is automatically muted. If you wish to submit questions, you may do so by using the Q&A box located at the bottom right of your screen. You must select Send to all panelists and not to specific individuals. Q&A questions will only be visible to all once they have been answered. You'll be the only one who will be able to see your own questions in the Q&A box. In addition, we have a feedback tool option in which you can use to share your reactions during the presentation. The icon looks like a speaker, as you can see on the slide. Lastly, we will be conducting 2 polls during the webinar. We kindly ask you that once these are displayed on your screen, make sure to select your answer and click on the Submit button. Please note that this session will be recorded. Now we'll go ahead and get started. I'll be handing it over to Joseph. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. Please stay healthy and stay safe. This is how we're going to be starting. My name is Joseph Sweden, and I'm the head of ground operations at Iata. I would like to welcome you to the Iata Ground Operation webinar that is going to be focused on helping in this difficult time. Over the past couple of weeks, the ground operations team has been working with various industry stakeholders and other Iata colleagues to compile a set of practical guidelines to assist with operations and the orderly shutdown process as our industry rapidly goes to a minimum or in some cases, zero operations. These guidelines are reviewed and updated as we get more information, with the result that we are already on bulletin number 2. Links to the guidelines I provided here and again at the end of the webinar in case you haven't already accessed them. These guidelines are of necessity generic in nature, designed to be widely applicable to assist the greatest number of users with the essentials to get them through this tough time. The topics of the ground handling guidelines covering the COVID-19 are for passenger handling, ramp handling, ULD handling, aircraft cleaning and catering handling, ground support equipment procedures, and ground handling training. We have also developed a separate document that deals with the highly complex topic of carrying cargo in passenger cabin. Feedback from the industry on this initiative has been overwhelmingly positive, and we are on the right track. What we hope to do with this webinar is to get a better idea of the challenges being faced by the industry in a specific aspect of the operation, as well as assess the need for additional guidelines and possible training. Based on how this webinar, we are planning to run webinars on other ground operation topics in the coming weeks. Please keep a lookout on the ground operations. And now I would like to deal with the specific topic of our webinar today, which is the ground support equipment storage, by inviting one of my team, Steve Savage, as a moderator for this session. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Joseph. Good day, everybody. I'm Steve Savage, Senior Analyst, Ground Operations at Iata. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today. Bartu Korgel, Head of GSE Planning, Donata International, Michael Heikens, Project Manager, GSE at KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, Thomas Heer, Head of R&D, Mulag, and Mark Vaughan, Head of Fuel Management, South African Airways, and Chair of IATA's Technical Fuel Group, who can help us if there are any fuel-related questions. I would just like to give a quick overview of the GSE part of the guidelines that Joseph mentioned. Primary aim of the GSE guidelines are to preserve the GSE fleet in a safe, fully functional condition for a quick return to safe operations with least possible cost. This is covered under 3 headings: preparation, storage, and return to service. Unfortunately, the luxury of preparation was probably denied us as the industry scrambled to park equipment and then left us wondering what we should be doing to properly store GSE for what could be a long time and how this was going to be done on minimal or non-existent staff. This is why we've grouped the preparation with storage for the purposes of this webinar. As Joseph mentioned, the guidelines are developed and vetted by some of our industry stakeholders and contain practical recommendations on various aspects under each of the headings. This WebEx is going to run in 2 sections. First, we're going to deal with the preparation and storage aspects and address the questions or points of view on those aspects submitted via the Q&A box. After that, we will deal with the return to service aspects as a separate section. So before we get started with our panel discussion, I'd like to ask you to start submitting questions related to preparation and storage to the panel. Please remember that you can only see your own question and the questions that have been answered. Because it is likely we won't be able to deal with all the questions, we have a team in the background analyzing and consolidating them. I will be reading the questions or the points raised to the panelists for their response. To get things going, I would like to ask Thomas, what has been your experience as a GSE manufacturer during this crisis so far?
So we have a lot of questions from customers how they should store the GSE equipment they have, and if we have storage material, because a lot of customers don't have roof or parking places with roof to park the GSE equipment. So the most question is if we have storage material like cover heads or something like that to store the equipment. The other thing is the handling height of the belt loaders, because of the missing passenger flights who carries cargo with. The main deck loading is at the moment a big problem. If we have belt loaders for main deck loading on stock, and these are the most questions at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, the issue of using passenger aircraft and the passenger cabin for cargo is definitely something that is more than slightly hot topic there.
Yeah.
Batu and Michiel, and as GSE users, you're right in there in the operational environment. What has been your experience so far? Is there any lessons you've learned or things you would have liked to have done differently?
Yeah, not yet. We are figuring out as anybody is. I think we focus on rotating the equipment and trying not to store them too long because of all the issues we would have then taking it into use again. So basically we got shifts for the equipment for the little flights we still have to operate them, or do a fake use to keep it in working order.
Arthur?
Thanks, Steve, and good day, everyone. I'd like to start by saying, the outbreak started in Asia region, spread to Middle East and Europe, and then to America. And as it passed from east to west, the airports and airlines based in those regions were impacted respectively, and do not operate in many airports within these regions. So by the time World Health Organization announced COVID outbreak as pandemic, we already had identified the excess GSE and segregated them in some of our businesses, mainly in Asia Pacific region. We applied different models while segregating them depending on the level of operational impact. Mainly we had units that were stood down, meaning they were inspected regularly and rotated in operation, or deactivated or as some people call mothballed, meaning prepared for longer-term storage. The process of identifying the need and parking the rest was pretty much managed by our local businesses. However, we still felt there was a need to have a guideline which our GSE managers could refer to. And most of the manufacturers already have detailed steps to follow in their manuals. And while we refer to them, we still wanted to prepare a quick reference point highlighting key preventive actions and best practices in order to store a GSE for a long time. So the key points we highlighted was, as Thomas also mentioned, parking at a covered area wherever possible. But if that's not possible, at least making sure that we shut the windows and cover the operational panels of the units. Disconnecting the batteries or isolating the main power source, inflating the tires, and also starting the units once a week to move and operate them at least for 10-15 minutes in order to avoid battery drainage, developing flat surfaces on tires, and avoiding seals to get dry. Also, from a safety perspective, choking units, securing accessories like hoses, cables, and also protecting the units against unauthorized usage were listed as key points. These are simple but important steps to preserve our unutilized own GSE in a proper way so that we avoid any unnecessary repair costs and we ensure that they will be ready for operation when needed again. But there were also two other key points that is absolutely necessary, which was not mentioned in OEM manuals, which is to fix the units as they break down and avoiding cannibalization. And as a result of all these learnings we have updated our global maintenance manual, included these guidelines for any future need, because not only a pandemic situation, even if there are seasonal airports that have a high peak and then low operational seasons, these kind of storage guidelines would be useful. And we also updated our maintenance management systems and adapted our telematic systems rules accordingly.
Thanks very much for that, Batu. Mark, something that's come up quite recently was the topic of fuel tank trucks. Have you got anything to add to that on the point of view of storage or use of them?
Yes, I have. Thanks, Stephen. Just as far as fuel is concerned and the dispensers that connect to the hydrant systems, as well as the fuel trucks that have got the tanks on the back, there's been guidelines put together by the various standard bodies. The standard bodies that we see for fuel, the two biggest ones in the world is A4A, which has got the ATA 103 standard, and JIG, which is the Joint Inspection Group. Is across the world. Of course, in China and in Russia, they've also got their own standards, but pretty much the same. But what's happened with this COVID virus, there has been guidelines and bulletins that have been brought out to cover the handling of the shutdown of many facilities and also the reduced number of vehicles being used. So if we just talk specifically about the refuelers and the dispensers that connect to the hydrant, there are recommendations out there to rotate them at stations where there is limited uplifts, that you rotate your equipment or the equipment in use must be rotated, that you keep the systems wet, because it's important to keep the systems wet. If you have filters that become dry or partially dry, they have to be replaced. So the recommendations on stations where significant amounts of equipment have been parked, possible filter elements out of the vessels, and then once operations ramp up to normal, to replace it. So that is one of the recommendations. And then the vehicles that are being kept in use need to be rotated on a weekly basis at least, to carry on refueling and keep the systems wet. The hoses, for instance, cannot become dry because they become brittle and crack, and of course there's leakage and other problems that arise from that. But just to give you a little bit more on that, as I say, the bulletins out there from JIG, for instance, is bulletin 107 and 108, and 127 and 128. And then A4A has also got a bulletin that they've released that is bulletin 2020.1, which is a good point of reference. So that is as far as that's concerned. We can discuss in more in depth as we go along on this webinar. If there are questions that come up that I can answer. But in short, there's guidelines out there for equipment, and it's important that we mothball and look after this equipment during this time so that we can recommission it at the right time successfully and safely.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. And just going to remind everybody, please use the Q&A section to the right of your screen to submit questions to the panel. And then before we move on to those, I'm going to just do a little poll with you. There's 2 minutes to get the poll done, and remember, please, to select the answer that you want, and then press on the submit button so that your result is captured. Also, I would like to point out that the poll answers are not traceable back to the attendees. Right. While that is going on, we have a question here about the handbrake on vehicles. Should these handbrakes be on, or should they be released so that they don't seize? If Thomas, you could give us an answer on that, please.
Yeah, it's better to have the handbrake off because the brakes could sticking after a long time storage. So you leave the brake off and use the shocks that the vehicle don't run away.
Hmm. Or alternatively, you could be putting it up on blocks, right?
Yes.
So that nothing's in contact. Okay, yes. Great. Good.
Steve, I think it's also important to highlight here that the stabilizers of the unit should be retracted, not extended, to avoid damaging the cylinders or the ground. Because a lot of cases witnessing before as well, instead of choking, the operators or the users prefer to put the equipment on stabilizers. Leaving them on long term on those stabilizers is not good.
Okay, good. As you can see, we've got the results of the polling here. And it's interesting to see that most of the answers have come in that we have 75% or more of your total GSE fleet is parked. Is that your experience, Batu, around the world?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I can't see the full question.
Oh, okay. No, it was what percentage of your total GSE fleet is parked or stored? So 75% seems to be the most.
It depends. It depends. There are airports where we don't handle cargo, therefore, due to the passenger load being nearly zero, yes, we park more than 75% of our fleet. Or there are some airports that we completely park everything because the airport is shut down. Mm-hmm. But in the areas where we have cargo operation, that number is much less.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And it seems that fair number of people. If we go to the second question, what percentage of your GSE maintenance staff are currently actively working on GSE? So it seems that people are down largely to between 0 and 25%. So the staff reductions have been quite significant. Is that your experience there, Michael?
Yeah, I think we are in these figures as well at Amsterdam.
Okay. And any contacts elsewhere in the world that would tend to agree with that?
I think on average, this would be the figures. There are some exceptions, like Bartu said, depending on your cargo part of the handling.
Okay. Another question we have here is load testing of GSE, can that be postponed, or does it need to be carried out during preservation time? Bartu or Michael?
So I think when you want to, the difference is, do you store it for a long time? So the mothball procedure, then you don't have to test it. But if you want to keep it in working order, you need to test it and do some minor maintenance to keep it in working order.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add, if you deactivated the unit for long-term storage, maybe what we apply is we pause the maintenance for that unit until we restore it to put back into operation. But if the unit is stood down, meaning it's rotated, then we carry on the maintenance as normal.
But would you adjust the maintenance schedule because you're not using the GSE?
It would be necessary to, it would be also wise to change it from hour-based to calendar-based, because the utilization will be very, very low.
Yeah. Okay. The other question we have here, going back to the question of handbrakes, what about the tires and engine conditions with respect to corrosion? What measures should be taken to that effect? i.e., hydraulic oil operated equipment, measures to be taken to ensure that corrosion doesn't happen.
So when you rotate these units, and operate them once a week for 10-15 minutes, and you circulate all the fluids in the unit, therefore the seals don't get dry and towards the corrosion. Again, in some parts of the world, during off-peak season, these equipment are operated or utilized very, very low hours as well. So in principle, you simulate that off-peak period. Therefore, units are always available when they are needed.
Yeah, okay.
If you have a longer standstill, look that all the fillings are on the maximum, so there is no space for condensates in the tanks, so the corrosion will be very low. Or if it's possible, rotate the GSE equipment.
So in addition to that, sorry, Steve, when you top off the fuel tank, particularly, you top it up to 90% to give it, allow it to expand, because you will have leakage when the summer comes. So, and the other fluids, of course, to the technical maximum.
Okay. There was also a question about the okay, this was sorry, I'm sorry, I misread this question. Taking ramp vehicles into consideration, Should the vehicle batteries be removed? If yes, why? I'm not sure whether this was traction batteries or the normal vehicle battery just for starting an internal combustion engine. What would be your answer on both those fronts? So if we looked at internal combustions, what would you be doing about batteries? Should they be removed or not? And if we're talking electric powered vehicles, what would you be doing about the batteries there?
If I may, for the units that are deactivated, the batteries could be removed since we don't expect it to be running regularly. But for the units that are still down, which we will start regularly, I would not say we have to remove. Just isolate the batteries.
Hmm. And for electric powered vehicles, there were a number of questions previous session about the electric powered vehicles batteries. Should they be left in? Should they be left on charge? What if you don't leave them charged? Then what happens with the control units on the batteries and that type of thing?
So for the electrical equipment, I think it's very important to keep the fluid level of the battery at the correct level. And depending on the charger you operate, I think it's best to keep it on the charger. The modern chargers will recognize the state of the battery and they will switch to a maintenance charge system. So I think it's important to keep it quite full. When you have an older charger, you disconnect it and connect it every 2 weeks to give it an opportunity to charge the battery again.
By default, then you're almost with the electrically powered equipment, you're exercising the equipment, as it were, because in all likelihood you don't have enough chargers to keep everything on charge, right?
Yeah, depending on the system you have, but the rotating would be the best, but maybe it's not always possible, and then you have to rotate to keep it on a charger every 2 weeks.
Okay, good. Just another question here on the fuel in the fuel trucks. Mark, a question here. What about the eventual deterioration of the remaining fuel in the tanks of the fuel trucks after a long period? Are there any risks there?
Yes, there's definitely risks as far as that's concerned. You've got any fuel that is lying dormant, stagnant in a tank after 6 months is considered to be long storage. There's procedures that you need to test that fuel before you can use it again. So ideally, if you're operating with a refueler, it would be best to rotate that fuel back into the tanks in the fuel farm. So not keep that stagnant in the vehicles. You need to keep obviously, as I said, you need to keep the systems wet. There needs to be some fuel in the tank of the vehicle. There also has to be daily sumping of that fuel to take the water out, because otherwise you run the risk of microbiological growth. And of course, you can't treat that microbiological growth in the fuel truck. It is allowed to be treated in the aircraft, but not in the truck itself, because you run the risk of overdosing should you pump that fuel into the aircraft. And then, of course, the aircraft's also been dosed to that fuel. So to answer you, yes, it is fuel. If you park the truck for 6 months or longer with fuel in it, that fuel is no more suitable for use in an aircraft and would have to be tested before it can be used. So ideally, what you need to do is set a program in place that you rotate that fuel back into the fuel storage facility.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Mark. Just another quick little question here. Is there any need to remove fire extinguishers from stored GSE? Must admit that's not something I'd thought of before, but what are the thoughts on that?
Yeah, we don't remove them. We just keep them on their normal maintenance procedure. So if they're due, we will replace them.
I would agree to that.
Okay. Then the other thing we got here was if fuel if fuel vehicles contain fuel, how much fuel will be considered safe or undamaging if stored in the vehicle tank for long?
Yeah, there's no limit. There's no limit to that. So as I said previously, just in my previous answer, is what I would do is take that or put fuel into the refueler, and then on a weekly basis try and use that fuel, refuel an aircraft. If you cannot do that, put it onto the test rig in the fuel farm and pump that fuel back into the tank, and then put the fresh fuel into there. So if you've got a 20,000 liter refueler, there's no harm in having 18,000 liters in there because it's got a vent system, so it can freely vent. And so you load it, there is no limit, but I would not have it empty either because you'd run the risk of the foot valves at the bottom becoming dry. And of course, you don't want the filter vessels to become dry, or the hoses for that matter. They need to be wet all the time.
I think this one was more about the vehicle's own fuel tank, but I imagine the same thing applies?
The same thing would apply there, absolutely.
Okay, good. Then the next question came about potable water and toilet trucks and its equipment, hoses, sanitizing. What should be done regarding these vehicles and their tanks?
So I think when you store them for a longer period of time, you have to dump them and clean them and keep them dry and ventilated. So the water truck particularly should be sanitized and should be sanitized before taking into use, and have the monsters, the samples to the lab to be sure it's okay.
And toilet trucks, again, just emptied and stored. So yeah, I imagine they've got vents on them, but you need to make sure that we don't get nesting birds and all that type of thing in there. Then what recommendations do we have for other electrical components other than just the batteries? But I mean, should we be putting silica gel in electrical cabinets and that type of thing?
I think the electrical cabinets, if they're already insulated, we check the IP rates of the components, and if they're already insulated, again, I don't see a requirement to put additional seal around the cabinets.
Okay, and where you've got exposed control panels and that type of thing, where you don't have a cab, is there anything special we should be doing there?
Covering the control panels is always a good idea to prevent them from sun, dust, and rain. So if they're exposed and if they're not kept on the roof, yes, definitely the covers, the panels should be covered.
Okay. Yeah. Please, could you let us know what can be done with high loader platforms and any other GSE where there's a probability of corrosion is high?
For high loaders as well, similar covers are available that would cover all the operating area to avoid any damage to the joysticks or the switches on the panel.
Yeah, and then I imagine the anti-corrosion treatment for the structure is much the same as for anything else, right?
Yeah.
Okay. There's some questions about the passenger boarding bridges. I don't know if we have some experience there. Is there anything special we should be doing about passenger boarding bridges if they're not being used for quite a long time? Any guidelines there? No, it's strictly not GSE as in vehicles, but Michael, do you have any ideas on passenger boarding bridges?
I'm not sure, but I guess in general they would be the same. So park them and be sure there's no open spaces where it can rain or corrode. Hydraulic cylinder should be in all the way. Measures like that should be the same, but I'm not a specialist on that.
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot there.
Recommend to check the manufacturer's manual for that.
Yeah, for sure. Then could we please define short and long-term storage periods? Many of the questions are related to long-term storage. What do we consider that to be?
For us, what we define anything that we foresee we will not be using for more than 1 month, we consider long-term storage, and we do prepare them for deactivation. Anything less than 1 month, we keep as stand down and we rotate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it differs per type of equipment. So electrical equipment not on a charger, 2 months will be too long. And refueling equipment, 2 months will be too long. You need to have extra measures. But when you put a diesel tow tractor, 2 months, I think you will be good operating it quite quickly after storage.
Okay, good. All right. So let's move on to the more positive aspect of this crisis, which is taking a look at return to service. Just a reminder to all of the participants, please, if you can start sending questions to the panel regarding return to service, we would be happy to receive those and address them. And just to get the ball rolling on that, Thomas, as a GSE manufacturer, what are your key points for an efficient return to service?
Yeah, the very important thing to do is make a walk around, look if there are any birds or flat tires or something on the vehicle. Then look for the brakes. Make a slowly drive with the vehicle and look if the brake is still working. These are the most important things on it. Yeah. Do you have any more, Batu or Michel?
No, I would say from a user perspective, as I mentioned earlier, we adopted 2 different models, stand down and deactivation. So for the units that are stood down, by rotating them in operation, we keep them ready to return to service in a very short time. And this is also one of the reasons why we follow this model for many of our units. But for the units that are deactivated, the preparation to return back to service would take a bit longer, but it doesn't require many days. As you said, just a walk around to make sure that there's no nesting or no damage. Would start with that and then take the unit for preventive maintenance if we have stop the maintenance on that unit. We would need to reactivate the maintenance regime for all the units. But of course, these are not going to happen all at once. We can foresee that the operation will be picking up gradually in some time. So we will be preparing these units back to operation, part by part. We also need to reactivate if there were any rules that were bypassed for telematic systems. Michael?
Thanks for that. Mark, is there anything that you'd like to add on the fuel side of things?
Yes, I would. It is extremely important to have identified which vehicles have been mothballed and which have been in use. But obviously, the obvious things is, first of all, to see that the vehicle is mechanically good to go back into service. But more importantly, is if filters have been allowed to dry out, you need to replace the elements before you go back or return it to service. So that the elements need to be changed. There needs to be millipores done on the hoses. So the recommissioning, it's important to do it as per the OEM's guidelines. So that needs to be done, and also as per the standard that you operate to. So in the case of the US, you would be operating to ATA 103. You would need to recommission those vehicles according to that. In Europe and most of the rest of the world, you'll do it according to the JIC standard, the Joint Inspection Group, or in any other countries or the legislation of your particular country, you'd need to do that. But very importantly, identify if a vehicle has been allowed to dry and then replace the filters. That's what I'd like to emphasize.
Okay, great. The other thing that has been mentioned before is things like airside vehicle permits and the like. I believe not every country or every area does this, but there are some places where the vehicles are only allowed to operate airside if they have a valid permit, and that valid permit is subject to things like the inspections and preventative maintenance being done and according to the correct schedule. So some kind of arrangements need to be put in place to make sure that when you want to return to service, that these permits and so on are available, or that there's some kind of extension if you haven't been able to do the maintenance, or that the maintenance schedule has changed. Any comments on that? Artu and Michael, I don't know if that applies to you.
At the moment, you take it in use, it should be right on schedule, and there cannot be backlog on maintenance or safety checks or whatever.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be, I think it needs to be a cooperation with the airport at that particular location, right? If you need an extension or something like that.
Yeah, you would.
Right?
I was saying it might depend on airports, as you rightly said, and I would recommend to check with the local authorities.
Okay. All right, we have some questions coming in on that, but before we go into that, we have another poll which we'd like you to quickly fill in. Again, it's going to run for a minute or slightly over a minute. And we'd like to just point out that the poll answers can't be traced back to the attendee, and to remind you to click on submit once you've selected the answers that you want. And we really do appreciate your feedback so Iata can better help you. While that's going on, we'll deal with a couple of questions that have come in. Then is there a ready checklist the ground handlers can use for return to service checks? Thomas, I think that would be something you could address. Is that covered in your manuals?
We have covered in our manuals. We have do a special site on our homepage for that for our vehicles, GSE storage. So mulag.com/GSE storage. And in the general overview from Iata, there's also a short checklist, but this is a general checklist. Maybe a few OEMs have other points in the checklist because of the special of their vehicle.
Michael and Batu, have you drawn up your own or anything more to add to that?
I think that you need to have an extra look on all the measures you have taken to bring it into storage. So if you inflated your tire pressure extra, you have to deflate it again. And when you have anti-corrosion, you have to take it off and things like that.
Okay. Then we have another question. For return to service, the minimum requirement is to do a full safety check inspection, but there are lots of things to do beforehand as part of the reactivation plan. So what are your plans looking like for return to service?
So, as recommended here, yes, full safety inspection is definitely a need, and if the equipment is deactivated, performing the full service before returning back to operation is necessary as well. When it comes to a plan, as Mikael mentioned, whatever actions we take now to store the GSE, we will review again and then reverse the ones that are needed. Example we gave about fire inflation. And the last point would be on the systems. Whatever configurations that are changed, let's say the maintenance regime from hour-based to calendar-based, these will be reviewed to put back if necessary.
Okay. Just to go through the poll answers to the poll. I see here that we have here have in answer to the question, have you developed a plan for GSE return to service? We have more people have developed a plan than not, which is really good to see. And that would be in line with our guidelines as well, because our emphasis there is to, while we might have shut down in a hurry and maybe without too much of a plan, that this is the time in which to start drawing up your plans for how you're going to be doing the storage, and also definitely how to plan for the return to service. Second question was, would you like Iata to create some e-learning and some training there? And it's good to see that definitely people think that that would be a good idea, which is great. Okay, on with the questions here. Would there be a need for certification by maintenance when GSE returns to service, or is a user level check sufficient? Could you advise on the duration before such certification would be necessary?
I think when it was out of use for an extended time, you will need a technical check and a technically based safety check as well before taking it into use.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my advice.
Yeah, for you, what would you call an extended period of time?
I think that would be 3 months or longer, just to be on the safe side, that your equipment is safe when you put it into use.
Okay.
I think, Steve, here I need to make a correction on what I mentioned before as 1 month. I'm not considering the seasonal equipment like the ices or air conditioning units, where typically they don't operate for many months. And
Yeah.
there is a specific, preserving procedure recommended by manufacturers. What I meant are the equipment that normally run every single day in your operation, and if you are not going to use them for 1 month, that's when we consider these are to be deactivated, and we rotate the rest of the units. These are mainly, this is mainly happening in larger stations where you have,
Sorry, you broke up there, Bartu.
This is usually a consideration for the airports where we have a large fleet.
Yes, where you've got a higher percentage of vehicles that are not operating.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Good. Another question here. What is on the horizon as possible failures when it comes to returning to service? Do we have any blind spots, uncertainties, or any topic that needs further exploring? So what would be the things that you would think, or possible failures that you think could happen?
I guess mainly seized parts that should be moving and corroded. I think Thomas would be a specialist in that.
Yeah, but I see it like Bartu. If you have not a electric vehicle, if you have a diesel engine, normally you will not have a problem if it stands still for 2 or 3 months. The only thing is the brake could sticking. This is the biggest problem I see. So I don't see any blind spots or something like that. The brakes could be sticking, and the batteries will be down if you don't do maintenance or do the battery on a charger in once a month or like something like that.
What's just as a matter of interest, newer equipment sometimes has these electric parking brakes. Can that be left off if you disconnect the battery? How does that work?
The electric parking brake works the different way. So it's a spring brake, so it's a spring-loaded brake, and the electric or the hydraulic just open the brake. So the problem is, or not a problem, if you remove the power on the unit, the brake will still close. So you had to open it manually. And if you have the hydraulic, if you don't open it manually, you had to check the pressure of the brake, so it will not close automatically. But we have if you have a electric brake, normally in the maintenance list there is a description how to store longer than 1 month. So I know it from us and all our competitors. They do a special checklist if you store the vehicle longer than 1 month.
Okay, so that's covered there.
Yeah.
Steve, I would like to add also a behavioral risk. I mentioned earlier about fixing the units when they break down and avoiding cannibalization. So if this, during the storage period, if this is not managed properly, and reality is in most of the workshops, they are not fully, they are not going to keep the full workforce. Therefore, if the technicians go and as an easy way start swapping parts from the units that are grounded, meaning cannibalizing the units, that would lead to uncontrolled repair activity and duplication of effort as well. Plus, when you need units, you will realize that that unit is not serviceable anymore. So, I see it more on a behavioral risk before going back to normal.
Yeah, so not only is this a good time in which, if you have the staff, of course, to being catching up on some repairs and that sort of thing, it's also very essential not to start robbing from one vehicle to keep another going, or just parking something because it's broken and not repairing it, and then just using up everything, because after a while you're going to wind up with a fleet of non-serviceable vehicles and nothing to use, and a huge amount of time to get everything back up and running, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Just another question here. Do we have any recommendations for hydraulic systems in particular? I think that was something that Michael discussed briefly. Was that just to keep things operating, to keep seals and so on active, right?
Yeah, when you operate the unit now and then, everything will be wet, will stay wet and will be in good condition. And when you store it, all hydraulic cylinders should be in the lowest position and keep your fluid levels on level. I think that's all you can do. Normally, there would be a filter dryer in the system, so your hydraulic fluid should be quite good when it's the maintenance is in place on the right schedule.
If you've had it stored for a while, would you do an oil change or not? You think?
I think I wouldn't do it just any time. Maybe when you get doubts, you can check your fluid itself, so you can test it if it's needed. But especially the larger equipment, there will be very much fuel in it or fluid in it. So
also, I would say
be necessary.
Depending on what time you replace that.
Yeah. Yeah, if it was due for an oil change, it would probably be a good one to do before you put it back in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think don't have any more questions here. So I would like to thank everybody and just remind you of the place where our guidelines are, which is here. And so we keep updating these. You can see on the ground handling part of the IATA website, you can find our latest guidelines. We are working on these and updating them as we get more information in. Now I'd like to ask Joseph Swedan, Head of Ground Operations at IATA, to conclude the webinar. Joseph.
Thank you very much, Steve. First, I would like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their business, which are in crisis, to help us by agreeing to be on the panel. We really appreciate their input. Our strategic partners, all our other industry partners, thank you. And our airline members who have helped us compile our guidelines. Of course, I would like to thank the IATA ground operation team, and in particular, Steve Savage, for preparing and moderating the session. But not to forget our training and marketing teams who have been supporting us with the webinar and providing the platform and the support to keep it all going. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for participating in the webinar. Your questions and answers to the polls have given us food for thought, and we try to help the industry throughout this difficult time. Our takeaways with the Fit to Operate, we need to start thinking about and developing our plan for return to service, which is our major highlights in there, and our takeaway from there reflects on the storage, and they're asking us to keep on looking and updating our manuals, look at the simplicity way into how you're going to protect your units. There are very valuable units. Without those units around the aircraft, it's difficult to do the handling, and actually they are the pivot or the paramount attention of our business on the ramp and how to push our aircraft safely. And also, we would like to refer to the guidelines that we'll be talking about, and we need to update them with any new information that we receive. Having said, please don't forget to follow our training page on the Iata website. Please see the link. It's over there. For the new courses that are actually being under development. And thank you very much for supporting the e-learning and what we can do from Iata to help and serve our industry. And finally, I would like to remind you all, please complete the short survey that will be sent to you, and it will help us to help you. Last but not least, please stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you very much for attending this webinar. Thank you.